Behind the golden gates of Ashworth Palace, where centuries of tradition mask modern-day betrayals, one dinner conversation would shatter the royal family forever. What started as an ordinary evening meal would end with packed bags, broken trust, and a shocking revelation that would make headlines around the world. Sometimes the most dangerous enemies are the ones who share your dinner table, and sometimes the most devastating weapons are nothing more than whispered words. This is the story of how a single moment of truth brought down walls that had stood for generations, and how Prince Alexander discovered that protecting his family meant making the hardest decision of his life. The autumn rain drummed against the towering windows of Ashworth Palace as Prince Alexander adjusted his formal dinner jacket for the third time that evening. At 38 years old, he carried himself with the practiced dignity that came from decades of royal protocol. Yet tonight, something felt different. The weight of responsibility that had settled on his shoulders since becoming heir apparent seemed heavier than usual, pressing down on him like an invisible crown. The state dining room gleamed under the crystal chandeliers, its mahogany table set for 12 guests who represented some of the most influential figures in the kingdom. Tonight's dinner was meant to be a celebration of the new charitable foundation that Princess Isabella, Alexander's beloved wife of 10 years, had worked tirelessly to establish. The foundation focused on providing education and healthcare to underprivileged children across the realm, a cause that had become Isabella's greatest passion since their marriage. Alexander's stepmother, Queen Regent Vivian, swept into the room with her characteristic grace. At 55, she remained strikingly beautiful, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, and her emerald silk gown flowing behind her like liquid jewels. She had married Alexander's father, King Edmund, 12 years ago, 3 years after the beloved Queen Mother had passed away from a long illness. The marriage had been controversial at first, given that Vivian came from a wealthy but non-aristocratic background, but she had won over most of the public with her charm and dedication to royal duties. "Alexander, darling," Vivian said, her voice carrying the slight accent that betrayed her origins in the northern provinces. "Everything looks absolutely perfect. Isabella should be so proud of what we've accomplished tonight." Alexander nodded, though something in his stepmother's tone made him pause. There was an undertone he couldn't quite identify, a subtle emphasis on certain words that felt almost possessive. He had noticed this more frequently in recent months, small moments where Vivian seemed to take credit for initiatives that were clearly Isabella's vision and hard work. "The foundation is entirely Isabella's creation," Alexander replied carefully. "She spent 2 years developing the programs and building the partnerships. Tonight is her triumph." Vivian's smile never wavered, but something flickered in her eyes. "Of course, dear. Though we must remember that royal projects are always team efforts. The crown's influence and resources make these wonderful initiatives possible." Before Alexander could respond, the double doors opened, and Princess Isabella entered, radiant in a midnight blue gown that complemented her dark hair and kind eyes. At 34, she possessed a natural warmth that had endeared her to the people from the moment Alexander had introduced her as his fiancée. Unlike many who married into royalty, Isabella had maintained her genuine, approachable nature, never allowing protocol to overshadow her humanity. "The guests are beginning to arrive," Isabella announced, her excitement evident despite her composed demeanor. "Lord Chancellor Pemberton just pulled up, and I can see Minister Davidson's car coming up the drive." Alexander felt his spirits lift as they always did in his wife's presence. Isabella had a way of making even the most formal occasions feel meaningful and personal. She moved through royal duties with grace, but never forgot that behind every handshake and ceremony were real people with real needs. "You look absolutely beautiful," Alexander said, taking her hand and bringing it to his lips in a gesture that was both formal and intimate. "Are you ready for your moment in the spotlight?" Isabella's cheeks flushed slightly. "I just hope we can raise enough awareness and funding to make a real difference. There are so many children who need our help, and they're lucky to have you as their champion," Alexander replied sincerely. The next hour passed in a whirlwind of greetings, introductions, and polite conversation as the distinguished guests took their seats around the grand table. Lord Chancellor Pemberton, a dignified man in his 60s who had served the crown for over 2 decades, sat to Alexander's right. Minister Davidson, the sharp-eyed head of the Department of Social Services, was positioned near Isabella so they could discuss the foundation's goals in detail. Also present were several wealthy philanthropists, including the Marchioness of Westfield, a formidable woman known for her generous donations to children's causes, and Sir James Hartford, whose family's industrial fortune had funded numerous hospitals and schools. The Bishop of Canterbury had also accepted the invitation, lending moral weight to the foundation's mission. As the first course was served, a delicate soup made from vegetables grown in the palace's own gardens, Conversation flowed naturally between the guests. Isabella spoke passionately about the Foundation's three-pillar approach: education scholarships for promising students from low-income families, mobile health clinics for rural areas, and vocational training programs for teenagers aging out of the foster care system. The statistics are quite sobering, Isabella explained to Minister Davidson. Nearly 40% of children in our most economically disadvantaged regions lack access to proper health care, and educational opportunities remain severely limited. We're not just talking about charity, we're talking about investing in our nation's future. Minister Davidson nodded approvingly. The government has been looking for effective partners to address these exact issues. Your foundation's comprehensive approach could serve as a model for national implementation. Alexander watched with pride as his wife commanded the table's attention, not through royal privilege, but through genuine expertise and passionate advocacy. This was what he loved most about Isabella: her ability to use their position not for personal gain, but to create meaningful change in people's lives. Queen Regent Vivian, seated at the opposite end of the table, had been unusually quiet during the first part of dinner. She smiled appropriately and made pleasant conversation with her neighbors, but Alexander noticed she seemed distracted, occasionally glancing at her phone despite the strict protocol against such behavior during formal dinners. As the main course arrived, herb-crusted lamb with seasonal vegetables, the conversation shifted to funding strategies and implementation timelines. Sir James Hartford expressed interest in establishing a scholarship program in his late wife's name, while the Marchioness offered to host a gala at her estate to raise additional funds. "This is exactly the kind of collaboration we hoped for," Isabella said, her eyes shining with enthusiasm. "When people of influence work together for a common cause, we can achieve incredible things." It was then that Queen Regent Vivian finally spoke up, her voice cutting through the warm atmosphere like a blade through silk. "Isabella, dear, I hope you've given proper consideration to the administrative complexities of such an ambitious undertaking. Running a foundation of this scale requires significant experience in financial management and organizational oversight." The comment might have seemed supportive to casual observers, but Alexander heard the underlying implication. Isabella's background was in social work and education, not business administration, and Vivian's words subtly questioned her qualifications to lead the foundation she had created. Isabella's smile faltered for just a moment before she regained her composure. "I've been working closely with experienced advisors and board members who bring decades of nonprofit management experience. The foundation's structure has been carefully designed to ensure both effectiveness and accountability." "Oh, I'm sure you have," Vivian replied, her tone remaining superficially sweet, "though I can't help but wonder if it might be wise to consider bringing in someone with more extensive executive experience to serve in a leadership capacity. Perhaps someone who has successfully managed large-scale charitable operations in the past." The silence that followed was profound. Every guest at the table understood the implication. Vivian was suggesting that Isabella was not qualified to run her own foundation. The suggestion was not only professionally insulting, but personally devastating, delivered in front of the very people whose support and respect Isabella needed to make her vision successful. Alexander felt his jaw tighten. But before he could respond, Lord Chancellor Pemberton intervened diplomatically. "I must say, Your Highness, that Princess Isabella's proposal and presentation have been thoroughly impressive. The foundation structure demonstrates remarkable thoughtfulness and attention to detail." "Absolutely," agreed the bishop. "The combination of passion and practical planning is exactly what's needed for effective charitable work." But the damage was done. Alexander could see the hurt in Isabella's eyes, the way her shoulders tensed despite her efforts to maintain royal composure. What should have been her triumphant evening was being undermined by carefully calculated words designed to make her appear inadequate. As dessert was served and conversation gradually returned to safer topics, Alexander found himself studying his stepmother with new eyes. The comment about Isabella's qualifications had not been a spontaneous concern or well-intentioned advice. It had been deliberate and strategic, timed for maximum impact in front of the most influential audience possible. When the evening finally concluded and the last guest had departed, Alexander walked Isabella to their private quarters, his mind racing with anger and concern. She had handled Vivian's subtle attack with remarkable grace, but he could see the emotional toll it had taken. "I can't believe she did that," Isabella said quietly once they were alone in their sitting room. "In front of everyone who matters to the foundation's success." Alexander pulled his wife into his arms, feeling her tremble slightly with suppressed emotion. She was completely out of line. "Your qualifications and dedication are beyond question. But what if she's right?" Isabella whispered. "What if I'm not experienced enough? What if I'm just a naive idealist who doesn't understand the complexities of running a major organization?" "Stop," Alexander said firmly, pulling back to look into her eyes. You are one of the most capable, intelligent, and dedicated people I know. The foundation is your vision, your creation, and your passion project. Don't let anyone make you doubt yourself. Isabella nodded, but Alexander could see that Vivienne's words had planted seeds of doubt that would be difficult to uproot. As they prepared for bed, he found himself wondering about his stepmother's motivations. Was this simply an unfortunate lapse in judgment, or was there something more calculated at work? The question would keep him awake long into the night, staring at the ceiling and trying to piece together a pattern he was only beginning to recognize. What he didn't yet realize was that tonight's dinner conversation was just the opening move in a much larger and more dangerous game, one that would ultimately force him to choose between family loyalty and protecting the woman he loved. Outside, the autumn rain continued to fall, washing against the palace windows like tears from a grieving sky. And somewhere in the vast corridors of Ashworth Palace, Queen Regent Vivienne sat in her private study, making phone calls and sending messages that would set the next phase of her plan into motion. The foundation dinner had been a test, and Isabella had failed to recognize the trap that had been so carefully laid for her. But Alexander was beginning to understand that his stepmother's ambitions extended far beyond questioning his wife's qualifications. What he was witnessing was the beginning of a calculated campaign to destroy Isabella's reputation and remove her as an obstacle to Vivienne's own rising influence within the royal family. The battle lines were being drawn, though only one side fully understood that the war had already begun. The morning after the foundation dinner dawned gray and overcast, matching Alexander's troubled mood as he sat in his private office reviewing security briefings. He had slept poorly, his mind replaying every moment of the previous evening, analyzing each subtle inflection in Vivienne's voice and every calculated pause in her words. The more he thought about it, the more convinced he became that what he had witnessed was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern. Isabella had left early for a scheduled visit to one of the children's hospitals in the capital, determined to maintain her commitments despite the emotional blow she had suffered. Alexander admired her resilience, but he could see the shadow of doubt that now clouded her usual brightness. Vivienne's carefully placed words had achieved their intended effect, undermining Isabella's confidence at the worst possible moment. A knock at the door interrupted his brooding. "Come in," he called, expecting to see his private secretary with the day's correspondence. Instead, Thomas Blackwood entered the room, his expression unusually grave. Thomas had served as Alexander's personal aide and closest confidant for nearly 15 years, having started as a junior staff member when Alexander was still learning the ropes of royal duty. At 42, Thomas possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of palace protocol and an almost supernatural ability to anticipate problems before they developed into crises. More importantly, he was one of the few people Alexander trusted completely, someone who could speak freely without worry about political consequences or hidden agendas. "Your Highness," Thomas said, closing the door firmly behind him. "I need to speak with you about last night's dinner. There are some developments you should know about." Alexander gestured for Thomas to take a seat, noting the tension in his aide's shoulders. "What kind of developments?" Thomas pulled out his tablet and scrolled through what appeared to be a collection of news articles and social media posts. "Someone at last night's dinner has been talking to the press. There are already 3 different stories circulating about Princess Isabella's foundation, and none of them are particularly flattering." "Show me." The first article, published in the Morning Herald, carried the headline, "Royal Foundation Faces Questions Over Leadership Qualifications." The piece, attributed to an unnamed source described as "someone present at last night's dinner," questioned whether Princess Isabella possessed the necessary experience to manage a large-scale charitable organization. The article was carefully written to avoid direct attacks, instead raising concerns about accountability and financial oversight. The second story, appearing in the Royal Observer, was more direct. "Foundation friction. Palace insiders worry about amateur hour," included quotes from an anonymous attendee suggesting that well-meaning enthusiasm cannot substitute for professional competence in matters of such importance. The third piece was the most damaging, published on a popular gossip blog with the inflammatory title, "Is she in over her head?" This article went beyond questioning Isabella's qualifications to suggest that the foundation was nothing more than a publicity stunt designed to boost her personal image. "These all appeared within hours of the dinner ending," Thomas explained quietly. "The timing suggests coordinated effort rather than spontaneous media interest." Someone wanted these stories out quickly, while the dinner conversation was still fresh in people's minds. Alexander's hands clenched into fists as he read. Each article contained details that could only have come from someone who was present at the dinner, Someone who had access to the specific conversations and interactions that had taken place. The unnamed sources all seemed to echo the same concerns that Vivian had raised, using similar language and focusing on the same apparent weaknesses. Who spoke to these reporters? Alexander asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew the answer. That's where it gets complicated, Thomas replied. I've made some discreet inquiries with the editors involved. None of them will reveal their sources, but I did learn something interesting. All three stories were pitched to the publications by the same public relations firm, Stratton Communications. Alexander's blood ran cold. He knew that name well. Stratton Communications was a high-end PR firm that specialized in reputation management for wealthy clients and political figures. They were known for their sophisticated approach to media manipulation, capable of planting stories that appeared to come from multiple independent sources, while actually originating from a single client. Who hired Stratton? Alexander asked, though he dreaded the answer. Thomas hesitated for a moment before responding. I haven't been able to confirm this definitively, but my contact at Stratton let slip that they're currently working on a project related to royal family dynamics and succession planning. That's a very specific type of work they don't take on for just anyone. The implications hit Alexander like a physical blow. Someone with significant resources and intimate knowledge of royal affairs was orchestrating a media campaign against Isabella. Someone who had been present at the dinner and had immediately moved to weaponize Vivian's comments. Someone who understood exactly how to damage Isabella's reputation while maintaining plausible deniability. There's more, Thomas continued reluctantly. I've been monitoring social media reactions to these stories, and there's something very suspicious about the pattern of responses. Hundreds of accounts have been sharing and commenting on these articles, but many of them appear to be fake or recently created profiles. Someone is using bot networks to amplify negative coverage about the princess. Alexander stood up abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked the palace gardens where he and Isabella had taken countless walks during their courtship. The systematic nature of the attack was becoming clear. This wasn't just gossip or spontaneous criticism. This was a coordinated assault designed to destroy his wife's credibility and undermine her foundation before it could even properly launch. Have you discussed this with Princess Isabella? Thomas asked carefully. No, and I don't want to unless absolutely necessary, Alexander replied. She's already questioning herself because of what happened last night. Knowing that someone is actively working to sabotage her would be devastating. Thomas nodded, understanding. What would you like me to do? Alexander turned back from the window, his face set with determination. I want you to conduct a full investigation into Stratton Communications and their current royal client. Use whatever resources necessary, but be discreet. I also want detailed background checks on everyone who was present at last night's dinner. Someone in that room is working against Isabella, and I'm going to find out who. As Thomas left to begin his investigation, Alexander remained alone in his office, grappling with a growing sense of betrayal and anger. The attack on Isabella was not just personal. It threatened to undermine important charitable work that could help thousands of children. Whoever was behind this campaign was willing to sacrifice the welfare of vulnerable people to achieve their own agenda. His phone buzzed with a text message from Isabella. Hospital visit going well. The children are amazing. Trying not to think about last night. Love you. The message broke his heart. Isabella was out there doing the work she was passionate about, helping sick children and families in crisis, while someone was systematically trying to destroy her reputation. The contrast between her genuine dedication and her attacker's calculated malice could not have been starker. A few hours later, Alexander was interrupted again, this time by an unexpected visitor. Queen Regent Vivian swept into his office without knocking, a breach of protocol that she had been committing more frequently in recent months. Alexander, darling, she said, settling into the chair across from his desk uninvited. I wanted to speak with you about the unfortunate media coverage this morning. I'm so sorry that poor Isabella has to deal with such negative press. Alexander studied his stepmother's face carefully, looking for any sign of guilt or satisfaction. Her expression appeared genuinely concerned, but he had learned not to trust appearances where Vivian was concerned. It's certainly unfortunate, Alexander replied neutrally. I can't imagine how private dinner conversation ended up in the newspapers so quickly. You know how these things happen. Someone always talks to the press, especially when there are concerns about important royal initiatives. People feel a responsibility to share their honest observations. The phrase honest observations struck Alexander as particularly calculated. It suggested that the media coverage was based on legitimate concerns rather than malicious gossip, subtly reinforcing the negative narrative while maintaining Vivian's appearance of innocence. Of course, Alexander said carefully, One might wonder why anyone would want to undermine a charitable foundation dedicated to helping children. It seems counterproductive to everyone's interests. For just a moment, something flickered in Vivian's eyes, a flash of something harder than concern. But it was gone so quickly that Alexander almost wondered if he had imagined it. "Well, I'm sure it will all blow over," Vivian said, rising from her chair. "These little controversies always do. The important thing is that Isabella learns from this experience. Perhaps she'll be more careful about taking on projects that exceed her expertise in the future." After Vivian left, Alexander sat in stunned silence. Her parting comment had been delivered with perfect sweetness, but the message was unmistakable. Isabella should abandon her foundation work and limit herself to safer, more traditional royal duties. The suggestion was presented as concern for Isabella's well-being, but Alexander heard it for what it really was, a demand for surrender. That evening, Alexander found Isabella in their private sitting room, surrounded by papers and looking exhausted. She had spent the day at the hospital despite the media attacks, refusing to let the negative coverage interfere with her scheduled commitments. "How was your day?" Alexander asked, sitting beside her on the sofa. Isabella managed a weak smile. "The children were wonderful, as always, but I couldn't escape the feeling that everyone was looking at me differently. The hospital administrators, the staff, even some of the parents seemed to be watching me with new eyes." "You're imagining things," Alexander said, though he suspected she was right. The media coverage would have reached everyone in her professional circles by now. "Am I?" Isabella asked quietly. "Or am I finally seeing myself as others see me, a well-meaning amateur playing at being a serious philanthropist?" Alexander took her hands in his, feeling how cold they were despite the warm room. "You are not an amateur. You're one of the most dedicated and effective advocates for children's welfare in this country. Don't let a few negative articles change how you see yourself." But even as he spoke the words, Alexander could see that the damage was spreading. Isabella's natural confidence was being systematically eroded by carefully orchestrated doubt and criticism. Whoever was behind this campaign understood exactly how to attack her greatest strength, her genuine care for others, and turn it into an apparent weakness. As they prepared for bed that night, Alexander made a silent vow he would find out who was trying to destroy his wife, and he would stop them. He had spent his entire life being trained to protect his family and his country, and he would not stand by while someone used sophisticated manipulation to attack the person he loved most. What he didn't yet realize was that the enemy was much closer than he imagined, and the battle was about to escalate in ways that would test not just his marriage, but the very foundations of his understanding of family loyalty and royal duty. 3 weeks had passed since the foundation dinner, and the situation had deteriorated beyond Alexander's worst fears. What had begun as isolated media attacks had evolved into a sustained campaign that seemed to anticipate and counter every move Isabella made. Each time she attempted to address the criticism or demonstrate her competence, new stories would appear that twisted her efforts into evidence of desperation or incompetence. Thomas had made significant progress in his investigation, uncovering a web of financial transactions and communication patterns that painted a disturbing picture. Stratton Communications was indeed working for a client connected to the royal family, and the scope of their operation was far more extensive than initially suspected. They had been planting stories, managing social media narratives, and even influencing potential donors to withdraw their support from Isabella's foundation. Alexander sat in his secure office, reviewing Thomas's latest report with growing horror. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling, pointing to a level of betrayal that challenged his fundamental assumptions about family and loyalty. His hands shook slightly as he read the financial records that Thomas had obtained through careful investigation and discreet inquiries. "The payments to Stratton Communications began 6 months ago," Thomas explained, his voice carefully neutral, "long before the foundation dinner. This suggests that the campaign against Princess Isabella was planned well in advance, not a spontaneous reaction to her charitable work." 6 months, Alexander repeated numbly. "That means someone was planning this while Isabella was still developing the foundation proposal, while she was working day and night to create something meaningful. The cruelty of it was staggering. Someone had watched Isabella pour her heart and soul into creating a charitable organization, had sat through countless conversations about her hopes and dreams for helping children, and had been planning her destruction all along. There's more," Thomas continued reluctantly. "I've traced some of the social media accounts that have been spreading negative content about the princess. Several of them were created by people working for a digital marketing firm that has ongoing contracts with Stratton Communications. The fake grassroots campaign against her foundation was professionally organized and funded." Alexander stood up abruptly, pacing to his private bar and pouring himself a whiskey despite the early hour. The systematic nature of the attack was becoming clear, and with it came a growing certainty about who was responsible. Only someone with intimate access to royal family dynamics would know exactly how to target Isabella's vulnerabilities. Only someone with significant financial resources could fund such an extensive operation, and only someone with a compelling personal motive would sustain such a cruel campaign. "Have you been able to identify the ultimate client?" Alexander asked, though he dreaded the answer. Thomas hesitated, his usual professional composure cracking slightly. "The financial trail is deliberately obscured through multiple shell companies and overseas accounts. However, I did find something interesting. One of the shell companies used to funnel money to Stratton Communications is registered to the same law firm that handles Queen Regent Vivian's personal financial affairs." The glass in Alexander's hand trembled, whiskey sloshing dangerously close to the rim. He had suspected, but hearing the confirmation was like receiving a physical blow. His stepmother, the woman his father had loved, the woman who had comforted him after his father's death, the woman he had tried to accept as family, was systematically destroying his wife. "Are you certain?" Alexander asked quietly. "As certain as I can be without direct confession," Thomas replied. "The evidence strongly suggests that Queen Regent Vivian is funding the campaign against Princess Isabella through intermediaries designed to provide plausible deniability. This wasn't just about the foundation or Isabella's public image. This was about power, position, and the future of the royal family. Vivian was methodically removing Isabella as a threat to her own influence and authority within the palace." "Why?" Alexander asked aloud, though he wasn't sure if he was addressing Thomas or the universe in general. "What does she gain by destroying Isabella?" Thomas cleared his throat carefully. "I've given that considerable thought, Your Highness. Queen Regent Vivian has held significant unofficial power since your father's death. She's been involved in major decisions, consulted on policy matters, and treated as a senior member of the royal family. Princess Isabella's growing prominence and obvious competence may be seen as a threat to that position. But Isabella never wanted power," Alexander protested. "She just wanted to help children." "Perhaps that's exactly what makes her dangerous," Thomas suggested. "Princess Isabella's authentic dedication and natural leadership abilities have made her increasingly popular with both the public and government officials. People trust her judgment and respect her commitment. In a monarchy where influence often depends on public perception and political relationships, those qualities represent significant power, whether she seeks it or not." Alexander realized that Thomas was right. Isabella's foundation work had indeed elevated her profile and expanded her influence beyond traditional royal duties. Government ministers sought her opinions on social policy, international organizations invited her to serve on advisory boards, and the media frequently portrayed her as a modernizing force within the monarchy. Without intending to, Isabella had become a rival to Vivian's position as the most influential woman in the royal family. "There's something else," Thomas added reluctantly. "My sources suggest that Queen Regent Vivian has been in contact with certain members of Parliament about potential changes to succession protocols and royal family structure. I don't have specifics, but the conversations appear to center around expanding her official role and influence." The pieces of a larger puzzle began falling into place. This wasn't just about stopping Isabella's foundation work. It was about reshaping the entire power structure of the royal family. By discrediting Isabella and limiting her influence, Vivian could position herself as the dominant female figure in the monarchy, potentially even securing formal recognition of her expanded role. Alexander's phone buzzed with a text from Isabella. "Meeting with potential donors canceled. They cited concerns about organizational structure. I don't understand what's happening." The message broke his heart. Isabella was out there watching her dreams crumble, unable to comprehend the sophisticated attack being waged against her. She continued to believe that the criticism was legitimate, that perhaps she really was inadequate for the responsibilities she had taken on. "I need to tell her," Alexander said suddenly. "Isabella deserves to know what's really happening." Thomas looked concerned. "Are you sure that's wise?" Princess Isabella is already struggling with self-doubt. Learning about the deliberate campaign might be even more devastating than the attacks themselves. Alexander considered this carefully. Thomas was right that the truth might be more painful than the lies. Learning that someone she had tried to accept as family was actively working to destroy her would be a profound betrayal. But continuing to let Isabella blame herself for failures that were not her fault was equally cruel. She needs to know, Alexander decided. Isabella is stronger than people give her credit for. She can handle the truth, but she can't effectively fight an enemy she doesn't know exists. That evening, Alexander found Isabella in the palace library, surrounded by books on nonprofit management and organizational development. She had been spending hours studying, trying to address the supposed deficiencies in her qualifications that the media had identified. "Isabella," Alexander said gently, sitting beside her on the antique leather sofa. "We need to talk." She looked up from her books, and Alexander was struck by how tired she looked. The confident, radiant woman he had married seemed to be fading away, replaced by someone consumed with self-doubt and confusion. "I've been thinking," Isabella said before he could continue. "Maybe I should step back from the foundation, perhaps serve in an advisory capacity rather than as the primary leader. It might be better for the children we're trying to help." "No," Alexander said firmly. "Absolutely not. Isabella, what's been happening to you, to the foundation? It's not what you think."
Over the next hour, Alexander carefully explained what Thomas had discovered.
He showed her the evidence of the coordinated media campaign, the fake social media accounts, the professional PR operation designed to undermine her credibility. He watched as understanding dawned in her eyes, followed by hurt, anger, and finally a steely determination he recognized from their early courtship. "Vivian," Isabella said quietly when he finished, "your stepmother is trying to destroy me." "It appears so," Alexander confirmed. "I'm so sorry, Isabella. I should have seen it sooner. I should have protected you better." Isabella was quiet for a long moment, processing the revelation that someone she had tried to build a relationship with had been working against her all along. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady and resolved. "What do we do now?" Alexander took her hand, feeling some of her natural strength returning. "Now we fight back, but we have to be smart about it. Vivian has spent months planning this campaign. She has resources, connections, and she's been careful to maintain plausible deniability. We can't just accuse her without ironclad proof. What kind of proof would we need?" Alexander had been thinking about this question since Thomas first presented the evidence. "We need something that directly connects her to the attacks. A recorded conversation, documented communications, or financial records that can't be explained away through intermediaries." Isabella nodded thoughtfully. "She's been asking to meet with me privately to discuss the foundation's future. I've been avoiding it because I was embarrassed about the criticism, but maybe—" "No," Alexander said immediately. "It's too dangerous. If she realizes we know what she's been doing, she could escalate the attacks or take more drastic action." But Isabella's mind was already working. What if we could turn her request for a meeting into an opportunity? If she thinks she's winning, if she believes I'm defeated and ready to give up, she might reveal more about her plans. Alexander felt a chill of fear. The idea of Isabella deliberately putting herself in Vivian's path, knowing what his stepmother was capable of, terrified him. But he also recognized the strategic wisdom of the suggestion. Vivian's confidence might make her careless, and a private conversation could provide the evidence they needed to expose her. "It's too risky," Alexander repeated. "We'll find another way." Isabella squeezed his hand. "Alexander, she's been systematically destroying everything I've worked for. She's made me doubt myself, undermine my relationships with potential supporters, and damaged my ability to help children who need our assistance. I won't let her win by default because we're too afraid to take action." Alexander saw the determination in his wife's eyes and realized that Isabella had made her decision. The woman who had been questioning her own competence was gone, replaced by someone who understood the true nature of the battle they faced. Vivian had made a critical error in her campaign. He had underestimated Isabella's strength and resilience. "If we do this," Alexander said carefully, "we need to be extraordinarily careful. One mistake could make everything worse." Isabella nodded. "Then we'll make sure there are no mistakes." As they began to plan their counterattack, neither of them realized that Vivian was already moving to the next phase of her own strategy. The foundation controversy had been just the opening gambit in a much larger game, and the Queen Regent was prepared to take far more drastic action to secure her position within the royal family. The war that had begun with subtle sabotage was about to become much more direct and dangerous, testing not just Alexander and Isabella's marriage, but their very survival within the treacherous world of royal politics. The private dining room in the Queen Regent's quarters was elegantly appointed, with antique furniture and oil paintings depicting pastoral scenes from the royal estates. Vivian had chosen this intimate setting carefully for her lunch meeting with Isabella, wanting to create an atmosphere that suggested concerned family conversation rather than formal confrontation. The table was set for two with the finest china and crystal, and fresh roses from the palace gardens provided a deceptively cheerful centerpiece. Isabella arrived precisely on time, dressed in a conservative navy dress and wearing the pearl necklace that had been Alexander's wedding gift to her. She appeared composed and dignified, though Vivian noted with satisfaction that there were subtle signs of strain around her eyes. The media campaign was clearly taking its toll, just as planned. "Isabella, dear," Vivian said warmly, rising to embrace her stepdaughter-in-law with apparent affection. "You look lovely, though I must say you seem a bit tired. I hope you've been taking care of yourself during this difficult period." "Thank you for your concern," Isabella replied politely, accepting the air kiss that Vivian offered. "It's been challenging, but I'm managing." They took their seats as palace staff served the first course, a delicate salmon mousse that Isabella barely touched. The conversation began with safe topics: the weather, upcoming royal engagements, and family news from Isabella's parents. But Vivian was carefully studying her opponent, looking for signs of weakness and vulnerability that could be exploited. "I wanted to speak with you privately about the foundation situation," Vivian finally said, her tone gentle and understanding. "I know how much this project means to you, and I hate to see you suffering because of the negative coverage." Isabella met her gaze directly. "I appreciate your concern, but I'm committed to moving forward with the foundation's work. The children who need our help don't care about media gossip." Vivian smiled sadly, as if dealing with a naive child who didn't understand harsh realities. "Oh, my dear, I admire your dedication. I truly do. But we must be practical about these things. The foundation's credibility has been seriously damaged, and that affects its ability to help anyone. The criticism seems to be focused on my qualifications rather than the foundation's mission or structure," Isabella observed carefully. "Perhaps with time and demonstrated results, those concerns will be addressed." "Perhaps," Vivian agreed, "but time is a luxury we may not have. I've been hearing troubling reports from government contacts and potential donors. There are serious questions about whether the royal family should be associated with such a controversial project." This was a lie, but Vivian delivered it with perfect sincerity. In reality, her contacts in government remained supportive of Isabella's work. But the Queen Regent was skilled at mixing truth with fiction to create believable narratives. Isabella's composure faltered slightly. "What kind of questions?" Vivian leaned forward conspiratorially, as if sharing confidential information with someone she trusted. "There's concern at the highest levels about the foundation's management structure and financial oversight. Some are suggesting that the royal family's reputation could be damaged by association with an organization that appears to lack proper institutional controls." Unknown to Vivian, Isabella was wearing a small recording device that Thomas had provided, carefully concealed beneath her pearl necklace. Every word of their conversation was being captured for later analysis, though Isabella was careful not to show any sign of the deception she was practicing. "I don't understand," Isabella said, allowing genuine confusion to color her voice. "The foundation's structure was reviewed by legal experts and financial advisors. We followed all proper protocols for establishing a charitable organization." Vivian waved dismissively. "Oh, I'm sure you did your best with the advice you received. But there's a difference between meeting basic legal requirements and operating at the level of sophistication expected of royal charitable initiatives. The foundation needs someone with more extensive experience in senior leadership roles." The insult was delivered so sweetly that it might have seemed like helpful advice to a casual observer, but Isabella now understood the deliberate nature of Vivian's attacks and recognized the calculated cruelty behind the concerned facade. "What would you suggest?" Isabella asked, playing the role of the confused and overwhelmed princess that Vivian expected to see. Vivian's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. This was the opening she had been maneuvering toward throughout their conversation. "Well, I've been giving this considerable thought, and I believe I may have a solution that could benefit everyone involved." She paused dramatically, allowing the anticipation to build before delivering her proposal. "I think you should step down as the foundation's director and allow me to take over the leadership role," Vivian said. "I have decades of experience managing charitable organizations and working with government officials. My involvement would immediately restore credibility and silence the critics." Isabella stared at her in apparent shock, though she had anticipated exactly this demand. Vivian wasn't just trying to destroy Isabella's foundation work. She wanted to steal it entirely, to claim credit for Isabella's vision and hard work, while positioning herself as the royal family's premier philanthropist. "But this is my project," Isabella said weakly. "I created the foundation, developed the programs, built the relationships with partner organizations. And you should be proud of that preliminary work," Vivian replied patronizingly. "But now it's time to let someone with more experience take things to the next level. You could remain involved in a supporting capacity, perhaps serving on the advisory board or helping with fundraising events." The offer was designed to sound generous, while actually reducing Isabella to a ceremonial role in her own organization. Vivian would claim credit for the foundation's successes, while Isabella would be relegated to ribbon cutting and photo opportunities. I need time to think about this, Isabella said, maintaining her act of confused uncertainty. Vivienne's smile became predatory. Of course, dear, but I should mention that time is somewhat limited. I've been approached by several major donors who are interested in supporting the Foundation's work, but only if there are changes in leadership. They want assurance that their contributions will be managed by someone with proven experience. This was another lie, but Vivienne delivered it with complete conviction. She was creating artificial urgency to pressure Isabella into surrendering without a fight. How much time do I have? Isabella asked. I think a decision within the next few days would be appropriate, Vivienne replied. We don't want to keep potential supporters waiting too long, or they might redirect their charitable giving elsewhere. As lunch concluded and they parted with false expressions of mutual affection, Isabella felt a mixture of disgust and satisfaction. Vivienne's performance had been masterful in its manipulative sophistication, but it had also provided exactly the evidence that Alexander needed. The recording captured not just Vivienne's demand to take over the Foundation, but also her admission that she had been working behind the scenes to undermine Isabella's credibility. Isabella returned to her quarters to find Alexander waiting anxiously for her report. They listened to the recording together, and Alexander's face grew darker with each revelation of his stepmother's calculated treachery. She's been planning this for months, Alexander said when the recording ended. The media attacks the donor pressure, even this lunch meeting. It was all designed to force you to surrender the Foundation to her. Isabella nodded. She wants to be seen as the royal family's leading philanthropist. My success made her look less important by comparison, so she decided to eliminate the competition. Alexander stood up abruptly, pacing around their sitting room with barely contained fury. I can't believe I trusted her. I defended her against people who suggested she had ulterior motives for marrying my father. I actually felt sorry for her when she talked about feeling isolated and unappreciated within the royal family. She's very skilled at manipulation, Isabella said. She understood exactly how to appeal to your sense of family loyalty and your desire to honor your father's memory. Alexander stopped pacing and turned to face his wife. What do we do now? We have evidence of her involvement in the attacks, but exposing her would create a massive scandal for the royal family. Isabella had been thinking about this dilemma throughout her lunch with Vivienne. Any public revelation of the Queen Regent's behavior would damage the monarchy's reputation and create a constitutional crisis, but allowing Vivienne to continue her campaign would mean surrendering to blackmail and giving her even more power to abuse. There might be another way, Isabella said slowly. What if we confront her privately with the evidence, give her a chance to withdraw from the attacks, and end her campaign against the Foundation? Alexander looked skeptical. Do you really think she would agree to that? She's invested too much in this strategy to simply walk away, Isabella clarified. But perhaps we could negotiate some kind of arrangement that protects the Foundation while giving her a face-saving exit from the situation. Before Alexander could respond, there was an urgent knock at their door. Thomas entered without waiting for permission, his face grave with concern. Your Highnesses, he said breathlessly, we have a problem. Queen Regent Vivienne just called an emergency meeting with the Palace Communications Office. She's claiming to have received credible threats against the royal family and is demanding immediate security reviews and protocol changes. What kind of threats? Thomas looked increasingly uncomfortable.
What kind of threats?
According to my sources in the communications office, the Queen Regent claims to have evidence that Princess Isabella has been receiving threatening messages related to her Foundation work. She's suggesting that the controversy has attracted dangerous attention from extremist groups. Isabella gasped. That's completely false. I haven't received any threats. I know, Thomas said. But she's presenting what appears to be documentary evidence to support her claims. If she succeeds in convincing the security services that there's a genuine threat, they could impose severe restrictions on Princess Isabella's public activities. The implications were staggering. Vivienne was escalating far beyond media manipulation and political pressure. She was now fabricating security threats to justify isolating Isabella from public life entirely. If successful, this strategy would effectively end Isabella's ability to work on the Foundation or any other charitable initiatives. Alexander realized that they had underestimated his stepmother's ruthlessness. Vivienne wasn't just trying to steal Isabella's Foundation. She was attempting to destroy Isabella's entire public role within the royal family. The woman who had comforted him after his father's death was revealed as someone capable of extraordinary cruelty and deception. How long do we have before the security review is completed? Alexander asked. Hours, not days, Thomas replied. The Queen Regent has convinced them that the situation is urgent. They are already preparing to implement preliminary restrictions on Princess Isabella's movements and public appearances. Isabella looked between the two men, her face set with determination. Then we need to act immediately. No more careful planning or gradual approaches. If Vivian wants to escalate this conflict, then we'll meet her on those terms. Alexander recognized the steel in his wife's voice and realized that Isabella had reached her breaking point. The woman who had tried to build bridges with her attacker, who had questioned her own competence and worried about causing scandal, was gone. In her place stood someone prepared to fight for her principles and her right to serve the causes she believed in. "What do you have in mind?" Alexander asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Isabella's smile was cold and determined. "It's time to empty the room and pack some bags. But not mine, Vivien's." The confrontation that would determine the future of the royal family took place in the most formal setting possible, the throne room of Ashworth Palace. Alexander had chosen this location deliberately, wanting the full weight of royal authority and centuries of tradition to underscore the gravity of what was about to unfold. The massive chamber, with its soaring ceilings, golden fixtures, and portraits of monarchs dating back 400 years, had witnessed coronations, state ceremonies, and historic announcements that shaped the nation's destiny. Queen Regent Vivian arrived at the appointed time, expecting to meet with Alexander alone to discuss the security concerns she had fabricated. Instead, she found herself facing not just the heir apparent, but also Princess Isabella, Thomas, and two additional figures whose presence made her blood run cold: Lord Chancellor Pemberton and the Director of Palace Security, Sir Marcus Webb. Vivian's composure faltered for just a moment, as she realized that her carefully constructed web of lies was about to be systematically dismantled. But she quickly regained her poise, drawing upon decades of experience in navigating high-stakes political situations. "Alexander, darling," she said with apparent warmth, "I wasn't expecting such a formal gathering. I thought we were meeting privately to discuss the security situation." "We are here to discuss security," Alexander replied, his voice carrying the cold authority of someone who had finally accepted the full burden of his royal responsibilities. "But not in the way you anticipated." He gestured for everyone to take their seats at the long table that had been placed before the throne. The arrangement was deliberately ceremonial, with Alexander at the head of the table and the others positioned to suggest a formal tribunal rather than a family discussion. "Vivian," Alexander began, using her name rather than her title in a deliberate breach of protocol, "we need to address some very serious concerns about your recent activities and their impact on the royal family." Vivian's eyes narrowed slightly, but she maintained her facade of confused innocence. "I'm afraid I don't understand what you mean, Alexander. My only concern has been protecting the family's reputation during a difficult period." Isabella leaned forward slightly, her voice steady and controlled. "We know about Stratton Communications. We know about the media campaign. We know about the fake social media accounts and the pressure on donors. We know everything." For the first time in the confrontation, Vivian's mask slipped completely. The sweet, concerned stepmother disappeared, replaced by someone harder and more calculating than Alexander had ever seen before. "I don't know what you think you know," Vivian said carefully, "but accusations without evidence are simply gossip and speculation." Thomas opened a thick folder and began distributing copies of documents to everyone present. "These are financial records showing payments from shell companies controlled by your legal representatives to Stratton Communications," he said in his precise professional voice. "The timeline corresponds exactly to the beginning of the media attacks against Princess Isabella. Sir Marcus Webb, a distinguished man in his 60s who had spent his entire career protecting the royal family, examined the documents with obvious distress. As Director of Palace Security, he had been briefed on the supposed threats against Isabella and had been prepared to implement severe restrictions on her activities. Now he was learning that those threats had been fabricated by a member of the royal family herself. These financial connections could be coincidental, Vivian said, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. "I support many charitable and public relations organizations. That doesn't prove any connection to negative coverage about Isabella's foundation." Isabella reached into her purse and withdrew a small recording device, placing it in the center of the table. "This is from our lunch meeting yesterday," she announced. "I think everyone should hear your exact words about the foundation and your demands for taking over its leadership." Vivian's face went pale as Isabella pressed play. Her own voice filled the ornate chamber, captured with perfect clarity as she outlined her plan to force Isabella's resignation and assume control of the foundation. The recording included her admission that she had been working with donors and government contacts to undermine Isabella's credibility, Lord Chancellor Pemberton, who had served the royal family with distinction for over 2 decades, listened to the recording with increasing horror. As the kingdom's senior legal advisor, he understood better than anyone the implications of what they were hearing. "Your Majesty," he said when the recording ended, addressing Vivian by her formal title for what might be the last time, "these allegations, if proven true, would constitute a serious breach of your duties and obligations as a member of the royal family." "Everything I did was to protect this family," she said defiantly. "Isabella's amateur efforts were making us all look foolish. Her foundation was becoming an embarrassment that reflected poorly on the entire monarchy." "That wasn't your decision to make," Alexander said sharply. "Isabella's charitable work had strong support from government officials, donors, and the public. The only embarrassment was the campaign of lies and manipulation you orchestrated to destroy it." "I was protecting your interests whether you realized it or not," Vivian shot back. "Isabella's growing influence was changing the balance of power within the royal family. She was making decisions and forming relationships that should have been coordinated through proper channels." The truth was finally emerging. Vivian hadn't been protecting the royal family's reputation. She had been protecting her own position within the power structure. Isabella's competence and popularity threatened to diminish Vivian's role as the monarchy's most influential woman. Sir Marcus Webb cleared his throat diplomatically. "Your Majesty, regarding the security threats you reported this morning, our investigation has found no credible evidence to support those claims. In fact, our analysis suggests that the threatening messages may have been fabricated." She had overplayed her hand, escalating the conflict beyond what even her considerable skills could manage. "What happens now?" she asked quietly, all pretense finally abandoned. Alexander looked around the table at the assembled advisors before delivering his verdict. "You have systematically attacked a member of this family using deception, financial manipulation, and fabricated evidence. You have damaged the reputation of charitable work that could have helped thousands of children. You have betrayed the trust my father placed in you when he married you. And you have betrayed my trust as well." He paused, allowing the full weight of his words to settle in the ornate chamber. "Effective immediately, you will cease all involvement in royal family affairs. Your official duties as Queen Regent are terminated. Your access to royal family resources, including communication staff, financial accounts, and official residences, is revoked." Vivienne sat in stunned silence as the reality of her situation became clear. She had gambled everything on her ability to manipulate and control others, and she had lost completely. "You will have 24 hours to pack your personal belongings and vacate your quarters in the palace," Alexander continued. "Security will assist you in removing your possessions to ensure that the process is completed efficiently and discreetly. The Foundation will continue its work as planned. Any attempts to interfere with its operations or my charitable activities will be treated as harassment and dealt with accordingly." Lord Chancellor Pemberton made notes in his legal pad as he outlined the formal procedures that would need to be followed. "Your Majesty will retain the honorary title of Queen Regent, but all practical authority and responsibilities associated with that role are hereby terminated. A formal announcement will be prepared explaining that you are stepping back from public duties for personal reasons. It was a face-saving fiction that protected the monarchy's reputation while making clear that Vivian's exile was permanent. She would keep her title and a modest allowance, but her days of wielding power and influence were over." Sir Marcus Webb stood up, his expression professional but cold. "Your Majesty, my officers are prepared to assist with your relocation whenever you're ready to begin packing." The use of the present tense made clear that this was not a request or a suggestion. Vivian was being given a choice between voluntary cooperation and forced removal, but there was no option for staying. As the meeting concluded and the others filed out of the throne room, Alexander and Isabella remained alone for a moment in the vast chamber. The portraits of past monarchs seemed to watch approvingly as the current generation of royals dealt decisively with a threat to their family and their principles. "I'm sorry you had to go through all of this," Alexander said, taking Isabella's hand. "I should have seen what she was doing sooner." Isabella squeezed his hand gently. "We both wanted to believe the best of her. That's not a character flaw. It's what made us vulnerable to someone who was willing to exploit our good faith." As they walked through the palace corridors toward their quarters, they could see staff members discreetly moving boxes and suitcases from Vivian's wing of the building. The Queen Regent, who had ruled through manipulation and deception, was being reduced to a collection of personal possessions and memories. 3 hours later, Alexander stood at his office window watching as Vivian's car pulled away from the palace for the last time. She had packed quickly and efficiently, maintaining her dignity even in defeat. There had been no tearful scenes or desperate appeals for mercy. She understood that her position was completely untenable, and that any further resistance would only make her situation worse. Isabella joined him at the window, watching the car disappear through the palace gates and into the London traffic beyond. "Do you think she'll try to cause more trouble?" Isabella asked. Alexander shook his head. "The evidence against her is too strong, and she knows that any attempt at retaliation would result in public exposure of everything she's done. She's too smart to risk that kind of scandal." Over the following weeks, the palace's official announcement that Queen Regent Vivienne was stepping back from public duties for personal reasons was accepted without significant controversy. The media coverage focused on her years of dedicated service rather than speculating about the reasons for her withdrawal. Isabella's foundation resumed its work without interference, quickly securing the funding and partnerships that had been disrupted by Vivienne's campaign. The children's programs launched on schedule, and within 6 months the organization was being cited as a model for effective royal charitable initiatives. The royal family had survived a crisis that could have destroyed marriages, reputations, and public trust in the monarchy itself. Alexander had learned painful lessons about the difference between family loyalty and enabling destructive behavior. Isabella had discovered reserves of strength and determination she hadn't known she possessed. Most importantly, they had protected something more valuable than personal relationships or political positions. They had protected their principles and their commitment to using their privileged position to help others. The children who would benefit from Isabella's foundation would never know how close they had come to losing that opportunity, or how much courage it had taken to preserve it. In the end, the palace room had indeed been emptied, but it was the right person's belongings that had been packed and removed. Justice had been served, truth had prevailed, and the royal family emerged stronger and more unified than before. The golden gates of Ashworth Palace continued to guard their secrets, but now they protected a family that had learned to distinguish between loyalty and manipulation, between tradition and progress, and between the price of peace and the cost of justice.